Welcome to part 2 of the 4-part webinar series, From Science to Solutions, Mobilizing Knowledge, Partnerships and Action Ahead of COP31. This series is brought to you by the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network, SDSN, in partnership with SDSN Turkey and SDSN Australia, New Zealand and Pacific networks. COP31 will take place in Antalya, Turkey, from 9 to 20 November 2026, under a shared leadership model, whereby Turkey will host the presidency, Australia will lead the negotiations, and the Pacific will host the pre-COP. Today's webinar on accelerating electrification and renewable energy will explore barriers to deployment, grid infrastructure challenges, and the role of international cooperation in accelerating renewable energy adoption, drawing on experiences from the Asia-Pacific, European, and other global contexts. The discussion will focus on how countries can move from long-term targets to real-world deployment at speed and scale. Before starting the webinar, I'd like to proceed with housekeeping announcements. First, please note that this event is currently being live-streamed on SDSN's YouTube channel with subtitles made available there. This recording will also be shared with all participants. Second, we hope to have time for a brief Q&A at the end of the webinar. Please type your questions using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen, and we'll try to get to as many of them as possible. So far, housekeeping. For the opening remarks, we have Professor Jeffrey Sachs with us. He is a world-renowned economics professor, best-selling author, innovative educator, and global leader in sustainable development. He is president of the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network, co-chair of the Council of Engineers for the Energy Transition, academician of the Pontifical Academy of Social Sciences at the Vatican, commissioner of the UN Broadband Commission for Development, Tan Sri Jeffrey Chie Honorary Distinguished Professor at Sunway University, and SDG advocate for UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres. Professor Sachs, we look forward to your opening remarks.
Gurkan, thank you. Thank you so much. Oh, I'm so excited to be together with everybody. If you watch the chats, you can see that people are joining from all over the world. This is very, very gratifying because we need all of us together to be pushing hard and in a smart way and in the same direction so that we can actually get the job done of green electrification and energy transformation. I'm very grateful to SDSN Turkey and SDSN Australia and the Asia-Pacific region and all of the participants. It makes me very happy and very proud and in a way very relieved to be together because we are thinking alike and trying to figure out how to move things forward. I'm in Bukhara, Uzbekistan today, an absolutely wonderful, magical place. I just counted 14 empires that have at one point or another ruled Bukhara, so it's been a treasure at the heart of Eurasia. And being at the heart of Eurasia, in the steppe or almost desert region, it's hot today. It's about 37 degrees C right now and rising. And I asked our guide just now whether it's always hot this way or whether it has been getting hotter in her experience. And she gave me a very dramatic account of how rapidly the climate is warming here, how change is coming at an astounding rate. It's not a surprise, of course. I think for all of us this year in this webinar together, every place in the world is experiencing upheaval in climate. And for many, many places this year, of course, all-time records are being set. We know that the rate of human-induced warming has accelerated. The estimate roughly is that from 1970 to 2010, the warming was at about 0.18 degrees Celsius per decade, and now it's well above 0.3 degrees Celsius per decade. The scientists are debating what's happened. The scientists that I am listening to that have been informing me about these issues for 25 years say that the sensitivity of the Earth system to the greenhouse gas concentrations is simply higher than was thought by the IPCC, basically consensus standard. There's a lot more warming built in to the energy imbalance. In other words, we've got a lot of global warming ahead. It's very dramatic. We already reached the 1.5 degree Celsius baseline. Within 20 years, we're going to be over 2 degrees C. The fact that we'll miss all the targets we set even 10 years ago to stay well below 2 degrees Celsius and to aim to stay below 1.5 degrees is not a cause for saying, well, we missed the target, so forget it. It is, of course, the very reason to dramatically accelerate what we are needing to do, which is to transform our energy and our land use systems to stop the emissions of greenhouse gases. Let me apologize at the beginning for my country's government, the United States. It's a rogue government. We're led by a fool, I'm sorry to say. What he did in the World Cup yesterday shows exactly his mindset. Rip up the red card, be the first leader since Mussolini apparently to challenge a red card, because Trump doesn't believe in any rules. He doesn't believe in any decency. And so we should just be clear that we need to move ahead despite people like Trump who are corrupt, fools, and dangerous. We absolutely need to move ahead. Well, one good piece of news at Antalya is that the United States actually won't be there because it's walked out of the climate agreements. This can make it easier, actually, for the rest of the world to get on with things, because the U.S. has been dragging its feet and holding the rest of the world back for years. And with the U.S. on the side, the rest will move forward. And I know that the United States will finally come around, because the American people are also disgusted with our leadership. This is not a popular position. This is a rogue government. So we, the rest of the world, have to move forward. And as our webinar today focuses on, a core, but not the sole part, but a core of our challenge is the energy transformation to have an energy system based on zero carbon. And to reach that objective, as we have said for years on the basis of science, certainly no later than mid-century. Well, of course, because the United States and others have dragged their feet for years, because the oil industry works overtime to tell fake stories, all energy, like Total, another disgrace, I'm sorry to say, yes, they believe in all energies. Well, no, we can't believe in all energies. We have to believe in all safe energies. That means zero carbon energies, not all energies. So we need to make the transformation, and we're going to have to do a comparable work on the transformation of agriculture and land use, because a huge amount of the emissions of carbon dioxide, of methane, of nitrous oxides come from land use change as well as from the energy sector. Today, our focus is on energy. And I think there is a fundamental piece of good news in the midst of the harrowing reality of the rapid human-induced warming. And the fundamental piece of good news is the technologies have improved so spectacularly during the last 10 years, in large part, let me say, due to China, that we have a portfolio of technologies that can essentially, at no incremental cost, produce the energy transformation that we need. As I mentioned, I'm in Bukhara today. Why? Because I am part of a project, a Marco Polo drive of peace, culture, and sustainable development that is driving electric vehicles, specifically BYD vehicles, from Rome to Hong Kong during June and July. So we have gone several thousand kilometers in electric vehicles. We crossed Italy. We crossed the Balkan Peninsula. We crossed Anatolia. We crossed the South Caucasus region. We are now in Central Asia. We were in Kazakhstan, now Uzbekistan. We'll go back through Kazakhstan to China, all in electric vehicles. And I can tell you, not only is it perfectly feasible, and there are charging stations all along the way, but the vehicles are amazing. They are comfortable, they are smart, they are resilient, and they are cost effective. And so as we charge, in many of these charging stations, there are simply solar panels above the auto chargers that mean that this is completely renewable, beginning to end, when you're charging on green electricity and riding electric vehicles along the way. This is just one piece of the green electrification stack that is now available for us. We can produce power at grid parity or lower than fossil fuel costs using wind, solar, hydro, fourth generation nuclear, and other forms of zero carbon energy. We can store the energy at very low cost, especially because of the remarkable reduction of unit costs of battery technologies. We can use the green electrification downstream across the board for buildings, heating and cooling, for cooking, of course, for all forms of transport now, as the internal combustion engine is retired and replaced by electrification of mobility. And we can use the green energy to produce hydrogen for use in steel making, in other metallurgy, and for direct electrification of many pathways of industry. And of course, we can use the hydrogen in many different fuel cycles to provide zero carbon ocean shipping. And we will be able to do the same with aviation sooner rather than later. The so-called hard to abate sectors, and I think Lord Turner is going to join us, he's the world expert on this, are being solved one after another. So what is missing? Basically, we have two problems. One is politics, the politics of the old fossil fuel incumbents that don't want to give up, that have been very powerful politically, that have been very corrupt politically, by the way, that have paid for Donald Trump's election campaign, and that have this foolish president of ours spouting nonsense by the day. And this is not alone in the United States, of course. So the incumbent fossil fuel producers and their lobbying and their corruption are certainly part of the story. But next time you see Total advertisements in the airports or the metro stations that say all energies, roll your eyes. Disgusting. We don't need all energies. We need clean energies, period. The second problem, however, is different. And that is that while the transformation to green energy is feasible and affordable and in many cases, leading to an energy system that is cheaper than the fossil fuels and more resilient, it needs to be planned. And we therefore need the expertise of planning. And one of the reasons why China is so successful right now in the pace and scope and depth of the transformation is that it masters planning. And it has used planning, for example, in the Made in China 2025 plan of the last decade to leapfrog ahead in the new green and digital technologies. It got there through a deliberate public policy process. Unfortunately, the Paris Climate Agreement isn't really leading governments in the right direction. It is based on short-term, nationally determined contributions that have a time horizon of 5 or 10 years. But what we really need are plans over a time horizon of a quarter century. Every one of your governments, for all the people online, and I saw from Kenya, from Ethiopia, from Italy, from all parts of the world, your governments need plans over a quarter century, not how to reduce emissions by 20% or 30% like they announce, but how to get to net zero. Of course, there will be recalibration and relearning along the way, but these plans to get all the way to decarbonization are absolutely essential. Also to break the propaganda of the fossil fuel industry, because these plans demonstrate that full decarbonization is possible and if cost effective today. So we need long-term plans. We also need regional plans and regional cooperation. One of the core lessons of zero carbon energy is share it with your neighbors. Trade those green electrons with your neighbors. They'll have sunshine when you have clouds. They'll have wind when you have still skies. They'll have hydropower when your hydropower is off season. Make a regional interconnected grid and a regional interconnected power system. And then you can share at very low cost and reduced storage needs intermittent green energy. So make the plan, but do it at the regional level. That's why I'm very excited to be working with the ASEAN countries, the 11 ASEAN member states that are joining together to make an ASEAN-wide clean grid. Why I'm very happy to be in Central Asia now, where the Central Asian states are working together and also with the South Caucasus countries to produce a so-called green middle corridor, where the sunshine is tapped to produce green energy going both to the east to China and to the west to Europe, as well as, of course, meeting the growing energy needs of this region itself. And why I strongly advocate for the African Union to make an Africa-wide green energy plan. Africa is filled with sunshine, with hydro potential, for example, Grand Inga and the Congo River Basin. All of this needs to be tapped, but not one country at a time, but on a continental scale in the case of Africa, under the guidance of the African Union. And the final component that we need is a strategy for financing. As I've said repeatedly, the energy transformation is utterly affordable, but it is capital intensive, meaning that you pay upfront for the capital. You don't pay for fuel later, that's for free, but you pay upfront for the solar modules, the wind turbines, the hydroelectric dams. The fuel comes for free as sunshine, as wind, as hydropower, but the investments require financing. And for this, we need long-term, stable, affordable finance. And this is another innovation that's needed. We need to expand the role of multilateral development banks. Regions need to create their own new banks. For example, ASEAN could have its own ASEAN Development Bank. We need to scale up the banks that have been formed in recent years, such as the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank and the BRICS New Development Bank. So we need new financing long-term that reflects the basic fact that investment in green energy is a solid investment, much better than investing in fossil fuels, which is a dead end. And that the countries that need the scaling up are good bets, because if they put the infrastructure in place, educate the populations well, they have very rapid growth prospects ahead. So let me conclude here by saying that nature and science are giving us a strong message. Get on with it much faster. Don't let the old, corrupted, old guard, like the Trumps of this world, stop us. They are living in a different century, and they're living with a different set of ethics. That is, the ethics of ripping up the red card. Well, no, they cannot be allowed to ruin the world. We need to get on with it. That means our governments need serious long-term plans. Our governments need to work together with their neighbors, and our governments need to create a framework of reliable finance so that this capital-intensive green transformation can be accomplished. Let me end there. Thank again all of the organizers of this webinar, and especially the hundreds and hundreds of people from all over the world who are joining in today. You're joining because we're doing this together. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Jeff, for a great opening, providing an excellent overview and evaluation of the major issues, and providing very, very important messages. We will now proceed with the roundtable discussion. We have 6 distinguished speakers with us. Lord Adair Turner, co-chair of the Energy Transitions Commission. Ambassador Luke Danivalu, former High Commissioner of Fiji to Australia and permanent representative of Fiji to the UN office. Ms. Alkenba, director of the Shura Transition Energy Center. Mr. Luke Mansell, CEO of the Energy Efficiency Council Australia. Mr. Pablo Necosia, director of operations, Minyang Smart Energy. And Ms. Haditza Abdulmumini, SD7 Youth Consistency Global Focal Point and co-chair of the IRENA Youth Council. And myself, I'm Gürkan Kumbaroğlu, Professor of Industrial Engineering and Director of the Energy Policy Research Center at Boğaziçi University, President of the Turkish Association for Energy Economics. I will be moderating the panel. So I'm going to start with His Excellency Ambassador Luke Danivalu. Ambassador Luke Danivalu is the former High Commissioner of Fiji to Australia and permanent representative of Fiji to the United Nations Office and other international organizations in Geneva. He was also chief negotiator on climate change under Fiji's presidency of the 23rd Conference of Parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, COP23, and was deputy team leader during Fiji's chairmanship of the Group of 77 and China. Before joining Fiji's Foreign Service, Mr. Danivalu had worked as a lawyer in Fiji with the Attorney General's Office, Ministry of Education, Fiji Police Force, and Ministry of Trade and Commerce. So, Ambassador Danivalu, drawing on your involvement in the Powering Up the Blue Pacific, a partnership for 100% renewable Pacific, why is the transition to renewable energy so important for the region, even though it has relatively very low emissions? And how can the transition be accelerated?
Well, first of all, thank you for giving me the opportunity and indeed the invitation to speak today. As a Pacific Islander, this conversation is deeply personal, and I hear what Professor Sachs said in his introductory remarks and completely agree with him, and the passion and the energy in which we need to address this issue. The energy transition indeed is not an abstract policy agenda for Pacific Islanders. It is something we live every day in our homes, in our communities, and our economies. So why is this so important for the Pacific despite our low emissions? For us, renewable energy is not just a climate issue. Yes, it is about energy security, but it's also about survival, sovereignty, and resilience. Our emissions, as you rightly said, are tiny, but our exposure is enormous. Fuel shocks, high tariffs, shipping delays, and outages that affect households, schools, hospitals, businesses, and indeed our outer islands first. So I would say that that the positive thing for us is that the transition is already a Pacific commitment. And we see this in the 2050 strategy for the Blue Pacific continent. I won't mention the other aspects, but it's also reflected in our national energy strategies as a Pacific region. And indeed, our NDCs all in the same direction. We want secure, affordable, resilient energy, increasingly supplied by renewables. We recognize that progress is real, but uneven. Several Pacific countries and territories have 100% renewable energy targets, while others have set targets of 70% or more by 2030. Fiji's current electricity mix shows both progress and vulnerability. Just over 62% is renewable electricity, and over 37% is still dependent on imported fossil fuel, diesel primarily. But Fiji's energy master plan now sets a practical pathway to 95% renewable electricity by 2036 and 100% by 2045. And you take the monetary value of this, it would require approximately around US $3.67 billion by in investment between 2026 and 2045. Across the region, the economics are also compelling. In 8 Pacific Island countries alone, and here I'm referring to Kiribati, apart from Fiji, the Federated States of Micronesia, Papua New Guinea, Samoa, Solomon Islands, Tuvalu, and Vanuatu, the upfront investment needed to replace existing fossil fuel electricity generation is estimated at between US dollars 691 million and just over USD 1 billion, of course, depending on the technology mix. The second thing I'd say in response to your question is that 100% renewable Pacific for us is not symbolic. So it is fundamentally a development agenda, delivering reliable power, lower import bills, energy access, stronger public services, local jobs, and greater self-determination. And this was, of course, echoed and framed by President Surungel Whips Jr. Of Palau, framing it as the next expression of Pacific leadership. The Pacific can become the world's first region powered entirely by renewable energy. And the political timing matters that apart from Pacific milestone moments, including the Pacific Island Leaders Meeting in Palau later this year, we have the Pacific Pre-COP in Fiji and Tuvalu, and indeed the COP31 in Turkey, that create a clear window to turn this vision into financing, partnerships, and delivery. And the last thing I'd say, for us, acceleration in the Pacific means moving from aspiration to deployment of bankable pipelines, modern grids, storage, regulatory reform, concessional finance, technical capacity, and solutions that are designed for islands, for salt, for storms, for distance, and indeed for community and ownership. Let me stop there for this question.
Thank you. Thank you, Ambassador Danivali. I will quickly follow up on what you said. Actually, it was very well stated. the situation of the Pacific has been at the forefront of advocating ambitious climate action. So how can the global community better support you, better support addressing the financial, technological, and infrastructure barriers to scaling up renewable energy and electrification in the region? And what can the global community learn from the Pacific approach?
Thank you for that question. Very quickly, the global community can support the Pacific best by treating renewable energy as critical infrastructure for resilience and development, not just as a mitigation project. The barriers are clear, and I mentioned some of that, the financing gaps, the small fragmented markets, the weak utility balance sheets, but high transaction costs and limited technical capacity. Of course, apart from our geographical dislocation and policy or regulatory frameworks. In Fiji, for example, recent assessments point to outdated electricity laws and approval processes that can discourage independent power producers and slow renewable project delivery. But if you look across the Pacific, there are similar bottlenecks that can turn ready ambition into delayed implementation. So support must therefore be practical. And here I'm referring to grant-heavy and concessional, including risk guarantees and faster project preparation. We've talked often about simplified access procedures and the support to turn national priorities into bankable projects. But it must also finance grids, not only generation. And we've seen many of that in the past. Average grid losses of around 18% across the Pacific Island systems show why transmission, distribution, and storage, metering, maintenance, and climate resilient infrastructure are essential for us. So technology partnerships indeed must be durable, and this involves training, local technicians to be involved, spare parts to be provided, maintenance systems, and clear operating models, all of which matter as much as what we have been getting in the past, including panels, batteries, and wires. So international cooperation is most useful when it reduces risk and aggregates demands. So in terms of what the world can learn from the Pacific, our solutions are different, involving microgrids, solar plus storage, clean transport, resilient public infrastructure, and systems that are designed for outer islands, communities, and climate extremes. Pacific regionalism is the other lesson that we would offer to the world. When countries are small, cooperation is, of course, not optional. It is how we pool expertise, aggregate demand, and strengthen our bargaining power, and of course, speak with moral clarity. And so I want to end by saying that if the Pacific can deliver a rapid, just, and practical renewable transition, it will show island, coastal, remote, and vulnerable communities everywhere that energy transition can be locally owned, development-centered, and resilient.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ambassador Danibalo. So I will proceed with Ms. Alkenbaugh. Ms. Alkenbaugh is the director of Shura Energy Transition Center. She started working in the renewable energy industry in 2008 as part of Polit Energy. During her work in between 2008 and 2020, she has been part of a total installment process of 700 megawatt capacity of wind power, taking active duty on project development, investment analysis, project financing, and construction. Due to her experience in various duties and different directorial positions, she was able to master the renewable energy industry and its legislation. Ms. Ba, Turkey has made significant progress in expanding renewable energy while managing growing electricity demand. From Shura's perspective, what have been the most important policy or market mechanisms that have enabled this progress? And what lessons could other emerging economies take from Turkey's experience? You're muted. You need to turn your mic on.
Okay. Thank you, Professor Kumbaroğlu. It's a pleasure to be with you today, and I'm glad to have the opportunity to contribute to this important conversation. In countries like Turkey, electricity demand is expected to keep rising because of economic growth, digitalization, and over time, the electrification of transport, buildings, and industry. So the real question is not whether electricity demand will grow, but how that demand will be met. If electrification is to support climate goals, it has to be clean electrification. And this means that rising electricity demand needs to be met primarily through renewable energy, backed by grid storage and flexibility solutions. Turkey's renewable energy expansion has been enabled by a combination of long-term policy direction, well-sequenced support mechanisms, and the gradual development of the wider market ecosystem needed to sustain that growth. If you look at the Turkish experience, I would highlight three main factors. First, the policy sequencing has been important. First of all, in the early stages, the Renewable Energy Support Scheme, YEKDEM, played a foundational role by offering feed-in tariffs and priority dispatch for renewable electricity. So it provided the revenue certainty needed to attract investments at a time when the market was still emerging and financing conditions were more difficult. Local content incentives also supported this early phase by encouraging the development of domestic manufacturing and service capacity alongside generation investments. Over time, this did more than simply add renewable energy capacity. Actually, it helped create a broader renewable energy ecosystem in Turkey, including investors, local suppliers, EPC companies, consultants, and a growing pool of skilled human resources. That ecosystem building dimension is sometimes overlooked, but it has been one of the important reasons why Turkey has been able to continue scaling renewables over time. And as the market matured, auctions, renewable energy auctions became increasingly important. They introduced greater competition, improved price discovery, and created a more structured pipeline for solar and wind investments. So in that sense, Turkey offers an example of sequencing early support mechanisms, help build the market, while auctions became more effective once a certain level of market maturity had been reached. The second factor is the gradual improvement of system integration and market design alongside renewable capacity expansion. Because renewable capacity requires a power system that can connect, dispatch, and balance variable generation efficiently. Turkey has taken important steps in this direction, including investments in grid infrastructure, efforts to improve system flexibility, and demand-side participation, storage, and ancillary services. That said, I think it's equally important to underline that Turkey still has a substantial agenda ahead if it wants to meet more ambitious renewable energy and electrification targets. Grid modernization, digitalization, storage deployment, and broader system flexibility will all need to accelerate significantly in the coming years. In other words, the next phase of renewable growth in Turkey will depend not only on adding more wind and solar capacity, but also on making the power system much more flexible, responsive, and digital. And this is also where complementary market reforms become increasingly important. As variable renewables take up a larger share in the generation mix, design needs to be a better job of valuing flexibility, improving balancing and congestion management, and creating clearer investment signals for storage, demand response, and other system services. So one of the key lessons from Turkey is that renewable deployment, grid expansion, and electricity market reform cannot be treated separately. They increasingly need to move together. The third factor is the way renewables have been framed in the Turkish context. In Turkey, renewable energy is not only a climate issue, it is also an energy security and affordability issue. For a country that remains heavily dependent on important fossil fuels, wind and solar have become strategic tools to reduce import dependency, improve the current account balance, and shield consumers from international fuel price volatility. This framing has helped keep renewables high on the policy agenda, even during periods of economic stress. So perhaps the broader takeaway for other emerging economies is not that Turkey offers a perfect model, but that there are a few useful lessons in its experience. First, policy continuity matters as much as policy ambition. Investors can work with different support models, but they need a visible pipeline, predictable rules, and confidence that the overall direction will be maintained. Second, different policy tools can be used according to the maturity of the markets. Third, renewable energy policy cannot be separated from power system planning, grid investment, storage, flexibility resources, digitalization, and market reform need to advance in parallel with renewable capacity growth. Otherwise, integration bottlenecks will eventually slow deployment. And finally, in many emerging economies, the political and economic case for renewables is often strongest when it is linked not only to climate goals, but also to energy security, affordability, industrial development, and competitiveness. I think Turkey's experience shows that renewables can scale more effectively when policy support, market design, and system planning move in the same direction, and when those policies help build not only projects, but a broader ecosystem around the energy transition.
Thank you very much, Ms. Ba, providing a great overview on Turkey's experience and also elaborating on the necessary investment and reforms most critical to building a power system that can support higher shares of renewable energy. So, from the Turkish experience, I'd like to step back to the global evaluation and turn to Lord Adair Turner. Lord Turner co-chairs the Energy Transitions Commission, a global coalition of major power and industrial companies, investors, environmental NGOs, and experts working out achievable pathways to limit global warming well below 2 degrees by 2040, while stimulating economic development and social progress. He became a crossbench member of the House of Lords in 2006. Lord Turner, as countries prepare for COP31, how can governments, industry, and the financial sector work together to move beyond ambitious targets and deliver the investment, grid infrastructure, and market reforms needed for large-scale electrification and renewable energy deployment?
Well, thank you very much, and it's a great pleasure to be here. I hope you can hear me. I think the starting point to say is that, of course, clean electrification is hugely important. So the ambition is important. If you look at all the emissions that we eventually have to reduce to zero to limit climate change, about 60% of them, 30 gigatons out of 50 gigatons per annum, we could get rid of by electrifying parts of the economy that we know how to electrify, and by making sure that all of the electricity we produce is clean, zero carbon electricity. So that is 60% of the entire challenge of getting to a net zero economy is about clean electrification. There are other things that are important, and we mustn't forget those, dealing with the agricultural sector, dealing with heavy industry, but think about 60% of our challenge as being clean electrification. So the targets that have been set, for instance, at the Dubai COP28 of tripling renewables by 2030, that was a good, motivating ambition target. And there's a debate now as to whether at COP31 we will agree a global target that overall we want to aim for 35% electrification. Electricity is 35% of final energy demand by 2035. And again, I think that would be a good motivating target. But your question is absolutely right. It's having set those targets, how do we actually deliver them? Now, in the process of clean of decarbonizing the electricity system, the crucial thing is to have, and the previous speaker was talking about it, a combination of measures and policies that strongly take us in that direction. One of them is encouraging the development of renewable generation. Across most of the world now, the cheapest way to produce a kilowatt hour of electricity is not by fossil fuels, it's either by wind or solar. But of course, the big challenge with electricity systems based on wind and solar is what to do when the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine. So in addition to developing the generation, which we can now do at low cost, we need to have policies which are working out how to balance the system, how to deploy storage within the system, how to make sure, and I think the previous speaker was talking about it as well, that there is flexibility within the system to deal with intermittent sources of electricity. Now, the good news is that that is absolutely possible. There was a major piece of work which we produced at the Energy Transition Commission last year called Power System Transformation, where we looked at what it would take to run power systems with as much as 80% solar and wind, and how would you balance the system? How would you balance supply and demand of electricity? And we looked at 4 different climatic types. We looked at China, which is a mix of climatic types, at India, at Spain, and at the UK, a mix of countries which will be reliant on solar primarily, and ones which will be reliant, like my own, on wind primarily. And what we found is, on the basis of very detailed modeling, is that it is absolutely technically possible to run systems with as much as 80% renewables, intermittent renewables, even if you don't have dispatchable renewables like hydro, and that the technologies exist to do long-term storage, to do demand-side flexibility. But it needs a clear vision. It needs a clear vision. And what are the elements of the policies that you need to do that? One, you need to support new generation of wind and solar. That usually can't be left to an entirely free market. You need to use things like long-term contracts. They're still a form of markets where people are bidding in to provide a long-term supply of electricity at the lowest cost that there is. But then you either need to do one of 2 things. Either alongside that, you need to be having auctions for battery or other storage supply, or you need regulation that says that every time you put in place solar and wind, you put some storage alongside it, or you need to do what I think the Indian government has very effectively done, which is to use clever forms of contract. They have this contract called the round-the-clock renewable contract, where the developer of wind and solar can't just say, I'm going to deliver electricity to the grid when the wind blows or the sun shines. They have to put together a package of different sources of renewables, plus battery storage, plus other forms of storage, and commit to deliver electricity to the grid 85% of all hours in the year, and increasingly at time slots that the system operator can deliver. And what is interesting is that those contracts are now delivering bid prices down at as low as 3.5 cents, US cents per kilowatt hour delivered, not for solar when the sun shines, but for renewables throughout the year. And that's a real market test that we do have the ability economically to deliver renewables on a round-the-clock basis, but it needs these thoughtful policies about what are the contract structures, what are the regulations, what's the power market design, which is going to support that. So the crucial thing is to get into the details of power market design, also to the development of grids. What we often have with renewables is that the wind and the solar, if it's large utility scale, may not be close to the sources of demand, and therefore we may have to make sure that we invest in grids alongside generation. Our analysis suggests that of all the investment we have to put into power systems across the world to make them decarbonized, 60% is in generation, but about 40% is in the grids, either the distribution grids or the transmission grids. So it's incredibly important that as countries develop plans to end up with a zero carbon power system, that they focus on grid development, both local and national, as well as generation and storage. Overall, though, I'm very confident that we have the ability to build zero carbon power systems, which are primarily based on renewables. And let me be clear, I don't exclude a role for nuclear, and the Energy Transition Commission will produce a report this September looking at the role of nuclear. We think that in most places it will be more expensive than combinations of renewables and batteries, but in some countries it will introduce a useful element of diversification into electricity supply. So we mustn't be absolutist, we mustn't be religious about I'm pro-renewables or pro-nuclear, we must be pragmatic. But what we see is a world in which the electricity of the future will probably be produced 60 or 70% with wind and solar, maybe 10 to 20% with nuclear. We will have hydro wherever possible, and we will keep a fleet of a thermal dispatchable plant, maybe gas plant, but running only a very small number of hours per year. That's what we're seeing in the UK now. The UK is an interesting example. We've gone from a system which 15 years ago had 500 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour of electricity produced to one today which is 125 grams. So we've 75% decarbonized our electricity system, and we've done that by building lots of wind and solar and by switching the gas turbines to a flexible role where they only run when the wind and solar isn't blowing. So there's a whole mix of technologies, but I think we need to be confident that we can get there in decarbonizing the system. And we then need to focus on all the detailed issues of power market design regulation that will take us there. Finally, just a brief word on electrification. It's incredibly important to get this balance between electrification and decarbonisation important. We want to decarbonise electricity supply, but with zero carbon electricity or low carbon electricity, we want to electrify as much of the economy as total. And here too, the good news is that a lot of this is now in the money. It's cheaper. It's much cheaper to run an electric vehicle, whether it's a passenger car or a two-wheeler, much cheaper to run that than to run a diesel or petrol engined vehicle. And increasingly, we're heading towards the environment where EVs will even be cheaper to buy up front. That is already the case in China. It's already becoming the case in the UK. Cheaper to buy up front than petrol or diesel passenger cars. And the great thing is that when you use an electric vehicle, you use about a third as much energy because they are so much more efficient. They turn 90% of all the energy in the battery into kinetic energy to drive the wheels, whereas a petrol or diesel engine wastes about 75% of energy in wasted heat. So we have this technology. We also have technologies of heat pumps to replace gas or oil or coal in residential or commercial building heat. And those heat pump technologies can also be deployed in low temperature and medium temperature industrial heat. And that's why about 60% of all our emissions we can get rid of by electrification. So what should countries do on electrification? I think we should agree at COP31 in Turkey an overall aim of globally heading towards 35% electrification by 2035. But it's crucial then that within that overall global commitment, countries then work out what will be the specific plan in their country, which sectors can electrify fast, and which policy instruments are required. In many, it's about initial support for the development of the technology, initial subsidies for the purchase of electric vehicles, though the need for that is beginning to pass as they're getting so cheap. Development of charging infrastructure is very important. And then a very important link back to the issue of how we run the grids, which is flexibility, getting people who charge electric vehicles, ideally to charge them not all at the same time. And that's about flexible tariffs, time of day tariffs that encourage people to move their electricity demand away from the peak. Because it's inherent within the electricity systems we're growing, zero carbon electricity systems, that a lot of the cost is driven not by total electricity use, but by peak electricity use. So the more that we can insulate our buildings better so they don't all need to be heated or cooled at exactly the same time of day, they have greater thermal inertia, the more that people are on time of day electricity tariffs, which create incentives to charge their electric vehicles at off-peak times, the more that we do all of that, the more that we will be able to build clean electricity systems, which will also deliver us energy at a lower cost than we have in the past.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Lord Turner. With the global outlook and the necessities, I'm going to proceed with Australia. Now we start, before we had Turkey, you presented a very well outline of the energy transition issues needed to be addressed. And now Australia with Mr. Luke Menzel. Luke Menzel is the CEO of the Energy Efficiency Council in Australia and a seasoned executive and policy professional with deep expertise in energy transition and decarbonization. He also leads the Energy Efficiency Council's engagement with the annual COP under the UNFCCC. So, Mr. Menzel, Australia has significant potential to lead in electrification across buildings, industry, and transport. What are the key policy and market reforms needed to accelerate uptake, and what lessons from Australia's experience could inform other countries as they pursue their own clean energy transitions?
Well, thank you, Professor. And I should say that as well as those roles that you've just outlined, I'm also here representing the Global Electrify Now campaign, which is a coalition of around 50 NGOs that has formed to accelerate the rate and rollout of electrification and fast track not just the efficiency, not just the renewable rollout, but adding this third leg to the stool, electrification, which as Adair and Jeff and others have said is so critical to us hitting our climate targets. And given our friends in Turkey are co-hosting this webinar, I'd like to start by actually congratulating the incoming president of COP, Murat Kurum, for his leadership in championing that 35% target, raising the current electrification rate globally from the low 20s, where it is now, by 35%. That is no small task. But putting that flag in the sand is an early indication of the leadership that Turkey is looking to drive in this area in collaboration with Australia, and is very, very welcome. On your question, I suppose there's been a theme running through all of the comments over the course of today's webinar, which is that on the one side you've got the decarbonisation of the electricity system, and on the flip side you've got the decarbonisation of end use, largely through electrification, and it's no different in Australia. So we've got a great story to tell in terms of decarbonisation on the supply side of our electricity market. So 40% of Australian households now have rooftop solar on their roofs. Over 40% of electricity generated in Australia in 2025 were sourced from renewable sources, and we have a target to hit over 80% by 2030. We have a significant new program which the Australian government has championed over the last 12 months, which has seen over 400,000 household batteries rolled out, sort of leveraging those solar resources that we've had such success in getting out into Australian suburbs right around the country, and making better use of those solar resources, allowing households to move that energy to other times of the day. And in terms of our wholesale electricity market, we're already seeing batteries push gas peaking generation out of the market. Expensive gas isn't playing as big a role as it was even 12 months ago. And that is actually bringing down wholesale prices and lowering energy costs for all consumers. So a fantastic story to tell there. But if we stop there and pat ourselves on the back, of course, the job wouldn't be done, because we have about 11 million households in Australia. Around 5 million of them are connected to the reticulated gas network, and of course all of those end users, to the degree they stay connected to that gas network, are not going to get the benefit in terms of affordability or in terms of emissions reduction of all of those clean electrons. Similarly, we've got significant industries in Australia that are powered by gas. A significant amount of gas use in industry, about 75%, is associated with process heat. Much of that can be electrified now, and more over time. So in Australia, what we're seeing policymakers turning their attention to is like continuing to drive the rollout of renewables into the system, but equally understanding that they need to get into the detail of how to electrify all of those end users. And I suppose as we get into that space, the thing that we're very alive to, as I'm sure all the speakers are on this call, is that this is a complex space because there's different opportunities and barriers in different sectors in the economy. So from a policy-making perspective, then you need to be very alive to those differences and have really tailored policies, whether you're talking about households, commercial buildings, small and medium manufacturers, heavy industry, the resources sector, or agriculture. Like there's opportunities to leverage electrification to great benefit in all of those areas, but it's not a one size fits all approach. And so Australian governments, state and federal, are working through the process of kind of making sure they have the right policies in place to leverage the electrification opportunity in all those different contexts. We're doing well and in electrification, and probably the biggest focus at the moment is again in households, getting as many of those households as we can off the gas network. In the state that I'm joining you from, Victoria, in the south of Australia, we have about 2 million homes connected to the reticulated gas network. We've actually are running out of gas. Our traditional supply of gas in the Bass Strait is rapidly diminishing. So we've got that extra incentive to electrify as rapidly as possible. And the state government here is reorienting its traditional efficiency program to also include a significant amount of incentives for electrification. They've also announced a policy to phase out gas hot water systems. And so when a gas hot water system fails in this state from next year, the only option that will be available to households is to put in an electric alternative. And so there's actually that decision to phase out is very significant, because the replacement moment is in many ways the easiest way to kind of see that stock shift over time. And in terms of the final point of your question, which was around what other countries can learn, we're very conscious at the Electrify Now campaign that there's very, very different contexts for electrification in different parts of the world. The Australian experience is most relevant, perhaps in the global north, in developed countries, where electrification is largely a fuel switching story. We're getting off fossil fuels and onto electricity as quickly as possible. Of course, in the global south, in many cases, we're often dealing with first-time electrification, and so there's an energy. There is a strong energy access lens for electrification. Making sure that in terms of that development pathway, countries are able to leap to the 21st century technology, which is obviously renewables and storage and electric equipment, and not get locked into legacy 20th century technology. And so in terms of kind of how we support the achievement of that 35% target, an ambitious target by 2035. I think, as Adair was saying, like national plans, but also plans that are very tailored to the particular challenges and opportunities in particular parts of the world, both in terms of like the particular sectoral mix and kind of where those opportunities are in particular context, but also in terms of like the development context and kind of what the primary task is, whether it's a fuel switching task or it's primarily an energy access task.
Thank you very much, Mr. Menzel. So from the policy perspective, let's move on to the industry perspective. We've got Mr. Pablo Necochea with us, who is the Director of Operations at Mingyang Smart Energy. So, Mr. Necochea, from an industry perspective, what are the biggest challenges to accelerating renewable energy deployment at the pace needed to meet global climate targets? And based on Mingyang's experience, your experience, what changes in policy, permitting, or investment would have the greatest impact?
Thank you so much, Gurkan. It's a privilege to join this panel, and it's a privilege to support the SDSN's focus on turning climate science into operational solutions. This very much resonates with Mingyang's vision. I think it's relevant to highlight that this question cuts directly into the primary challenge of our decade of moving past very high level and very high and highly ambitious political targets and focusing directly into real world industrial execution, which is always easier said than done. And when we look at the pace and scale of global electrification, the truth is that the bottleneck is no longer the manufacturing capacity. It's no longer the technology, which is well proven. And we see that lack of capital is also not slowing things down. So the clean energy industry has already achieved a huge industrial scale that is now waiting for the right paths for deployment. The real bottleneck that we see is in systemic friction. Specifically, it's a very bureaucratic permitting process, very long and slow grid connection queues, as well as very fragmented market regulations that end up being de-regionalized or highly localized in specific countries without looking at a regional context. So right now, we have across the globe multi-gigawatt clean energy projects that are sitting there completely idle, waiting for a grid build-out that has great political support, but there is no real planning in order to get that grid constructed and these projects built and connected. So that's not because the factories can't deliver, but because they're stuck in an administrative limbo waiting for paperwork or transmission line allocations. So we're trying to meet really urgent 2030, 2050 climate targets, but we're using regulatory systems that go back to the previous century. And that is not the way that we're going to get this solved. So having established the problem, now we need to look into the solutions. And there's two solutions. One is a permitting solution and the other is an investment solution. So in terms of permitting, we have to shift from a sequential process where every environmental, administrative, and spatial review happens one after the other. And we need to shift into a parallel process with a single window where every permit is allocated in parallel and evaluated jointly, so that we go from project development cycles of 5 to 11 years into really short and effective cycles that can deploy the technology from today and not the technology of today in 10 years' time. In order for this to happen, planning must be centralized or should be more collaborative, as Professor Sachs had highlighted. We need to develop these go-to zones for renewables with pre-approved environmental frameworks that match the manufacturing speed that we can meet. And this leads to a rhythm of deployment that is steady and allows us to meet the climate goals. Now, in terms of investment, in terms of investment,
please proceed ahead, but we're rather tight on time.
Okay.
Please note that. So if you could wrap up in 1 or 2 minutes, that would be great.
Sure. In terms of investment, capital needs to shift from subsidizing pure generation, and it should shift to upgrading the grid infrastructure. Because if governments increase their climate targets at COP31, but don't fix the underlying grid and regulatory bottlenecks, then those targets are going to remain mathematically impossible.
Thank you very much, Mr. Nekocia. And our final speaker today is Ms. Hadith Abdul Mumini. She currently serves as the global focal point for the Sustainable Development Goal 7 Youth Consistency, co-chairs the IRENA Youth Council, and is a member of the International Energy Agency Global Commission on People-Centered Clean Energy Transitions. She's a lawyer and a mediator and advocates for sustainable energy access across Africa. So, Ms. Abdul Mumini, the transition to clean energy is expected to create millions of new jobs worldwide. What investments in education, skills development, and entrepreneurship are needed to ensure young people are equipped to seize these opportunities and contribute meaningfully to the energy transition?
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to join this very timely discussion. And building on the introduction, I also lead the Renewable Africa Initiative, where our work focuses on bridging the gap between energy transition commitments and implementation through community-centered solutions. Now, when we talk about the millions of jobs expected to be created through the clean energy transition, the next question is whether young people, especially in emerging economies, are practically equipped to access and shape these opportunities. Through my work with the SDG 7 Youth Constituency, the IRENA Youth Council, and Renewable Africa Initiative, I've consistently seen that the barrier is rarely a lack of talent or ambition or interest from young people. It is often the gap between ambition and then the market readiness. That is whether the young people have the skills or they have the exposure and the support systems that are needed to translate these ideas into implementation. And I believe we need 3 key investments. First is the technical, digital, and industrial skills. The energy transition, as we know, requires a very diverse workforce: engineers, technicians, data specialists, storage experts, energy efficiency professionals, and project developers, just to mention a few. But we must also be intentional that emerging economies are not positioned only as consumers of the clean technologies. They should be active participants in designing, adapting, manufacturing, and scaling the solutions that are needed for their own context. And this requires investment in technology transfer, local manufacturing capacity, research institutions, and skills ecosystems that allow countries to capture more value from the transition. Because a just transition is not only about where clean energy is deployed, it is also about who participates in building the industries and opportunities created by it. The second investment needed is on project development and entrepreneurship. Many young people have innovative ideas but struggle to move from that concept into bankable implementation-ready projects. So we need stronger ecosystems, accelerators, fellowships, mentorship programs, and partnerships that would help young people understand project design, financing models, implementation, and scaling. Because many youth-led solutions respond to real community challenges. It could be a clean cooking enterprise, a mini grid model, or an energy efficiency solution that may start locally. But collectively, these innovations determine whether global energy targets become reality. And this is one of the gaps that we are currently working to address through our capacity building programs and at RAI, and also through the Youth Sustainable Energy Hub of the SDG7 Youth Constituency. And the third is experiential learning. We cannot prepare young people to deliver a transition they are not actively involved in building. And this means we need to create pathways for young people to work with government, companies, utilities, research institutions, and international energy organizations, not only as observers, but as contributors. Through our community work, starting with a pilot project in Nigeria, we see that energy access is not simply an infrastructure challenge. It requires understanding the demand, the affordability, the productive use, the skills, and the local economic realities. So when young people participate in this process, they are not only gaining experience, they are helping design solutions that are more connected to the communities they serve. So if we want a just transition, we can not only invest in the technologies, we must also invest in the people and the systems that will deploy, manage, and sustain them. Because as we know, a system is only as strong as the people that sustain it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Abdulmumini. Now we can proceed with the Q&A session. We have a bit of time to answer questions. We have a huge set of questions. We cannot answer them all. There are questions related to the Pacific region, related to various issues addressed in the panel. Deep diving, but there are also questions related to issues not addressed in the panel. And I will pick up those questions in particular that were not addressed today. So first, there is a question on geopolitical dependencies related to critical minerals. As countries race to electrify and expand renewable energy, how can international cooperation ensure that the transition does not create new geopolitical dependencies on critical minerals, manufacturing capacity, and clean energy technologies, particularly for developing countries? I think this is a very valid question. Who would like to address this question from our speakers? Lord Turner, please.
Well, let me comment on the reliance on critical technologies rather than critical minerals, which was included in the question, and where, let's be clear, what we're talking about is reliance on China, because that has been the overall, to an extraordinary extent, developer of the crucial technologies of solar PV, not the initial science, but the commercialization and the cost reduction of EVs, of batteries, increasingly of hydrogen electrolyzers. If you look at the percent share of Chinese capacity and production in these, it's typically 60, 70, 80% or more. And they simply are the technological leader and the cost leader. And this is clearly seen as a challenge, not even so much in the developing countries, even more in the developed countries, because the developed countries already have, or mid-income emerging countries have, industrial development and industrial employment that they don't want to just see disappear in this new wave of the new technologies of the future. And at the ETC, we've been thinking about this. And the crucial thing is we've got to have an intelligent engagement with China. If the developed countries, all the developing countries, try to turn their back on China and say, we're going to have our own completely indigenous technology, let's be clear, we will simply increase very, very significantly the cost of the energy transition. Our wind turbines will cost more, our solar panels will cost more, our batteries will cost more. But on the other hand, we want, local value added and employment. And we want that, as was said earlier, in emerging, developing countries, and we want it in developed countries. I think one of the most important things is going to be an intelligent attitude to technology transfer and therefore to inward investment. Let's be clear, the most powerful form of technology transfer, which always occurs, is inward investment by the current technological leader. If you go back to China's industrial development strategy of the 1990s, it heavily depended on encouraging inward investment from the countries, whether they be European or American or Japanese, which were then more technologically more advanced. And now, in the clean technologies, China is more advanced. And I think across the world, countries should be encouraging Chinese inward investment. And that means they can get away from just importing Chinese technology. There's a role for that, but also encouraging the Chinese battery companies, the Chinese EV companies, the Chinese wind turbine companies like Minyang, etc., to open factories, maybe in joint ventures, maybe with local content requirements. There's lots of intelligent ways that you can play industrial strategy, but it has to be an engagement. It can't be simply closing the door. If we close the door to Chinese leadership in clean technology, we will increase the cost of the energy transition. We will slow it down, which is bad for the climate, and we will increase the cost, which is bad for consumers.
Thank you very much, Lord Turner. Mr. Mansell, you would like to address this question as well. And I would like to ask you, if possible, also comment on the critical mineral aspect of the question. Lord Turner has very well elaborated on the technology aspect, but there's also the critical mineral aspect. I'm thinking of lithium. Australia has a lot of lithium. It's one of the countries that has a lot of lithium research, right? So please continue.
Great. I'll address that in two parts then. The first one is obviously a huge amount of concern around the implication of the fuel crisis in Australia and around the world, and interest in electrification as a pathway to improve resilience. A debate that we have here in Australia as well. We may be reducing our reliance on fossil fuel imports from the Middle East, but are we just increasing our reliance on imports of clean energy technologies from China? That is a kind of a false equivalence in my view, because the reality is if the fossil fuels don't make the way to your country, all of your equipment immediately stops working. Whereas in the instance where you've got your solar panels, you've got your batteries, you've got your EVs, they don't stop working if there is some kind of geopolitical challenge that you're working through with China. So it's not that it's not a challenge, but it's a very different type of challenge with different timescales and arguably more resilience being built into the system. In terms of critical minerals, I think there is obviously an interaction between sort of foreign policy, defense policy, and energy and climate policy, and that is increasingly coming to the fore. And I know that our friends and allies are actively considering opportunity for friendshoring, for kind of like diversifying some of those supply chains, particularly around critical minerals, which are currently very, very focused around China. I think that's healthy, but I would broadly echo Adair's point. I think that the pathway to victory here is by kind of positive and proactive engagement with China. It doesn't mean that one can't be clear-eyed and looking to kind of diversify supply chains where that makes sense. But it's not an either or, and I think we need to have a holistic and sophisticated approach to all of these questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Negotia. We're actually out of time, but please, very short.
I would simply, well, I welcome Luke's point about diversifying the supply chain and delocalizing the manufacturing of lithium, of permanent magnets in the case of wind turbines. What I would also highlight is that there is a very specific role to be played by above ground mining, because when Western countries, or when you import these raw materials, or when you import permanent magnets with critical minerals, what you're doing is actually capturing an asset that remains in your country and in your region for the next 25 years and can be reused in 25 years after it has been consumed. So you can recycle that, and you can implement recycling policies that allow you to actually have a permanent and creative asset.
Thank you very much. So with that, we will be closing the webinar today. For the other set of questions, actually we have another webinar coming up, other events that I would like to announce. So we have the first event is Advancing a Circular Economy for Climate Action on September 9. And you will see the links to register in the chat box that will be posted there. Then we have Climate Finance for Impact on September 30 coming up. And then we have, and this is not a webinar, this is an in-person event, actually during COP31 in Antalya, the IAEE COP Symposium on November 11 to 14. This is the International Association for Energy Economics, of which I am the past president. It's first COP Symposium, and together with the Eurasian Energy and Sustainability Conference, and actually with COP31. I would like to thank all speakers for a wonderful panel, and all attendees for attending today. And I wish you all the best and look forward to seeing you in our upcoming events.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
My name's Mel Slade. I'm from the International Energy Agency and responsible for putting the conference together. And when we've been thinking about how to frame the conference this year, and because we found ourselves, of course, in this unprecedented energy crisis, we decided we'd like to focus on the immediate term. What can governments and the private sector do together to shelter consumers and small businesses from energy shocks? And then also, how can energy efficiency be used to build long-term resilience? And so these two panels this afternoon will start with sheltering shocks, so the immediate term, and then we'll go into another panel which will be on the resilience. So with that, we'll start our panel here. And I will introduce everybody to you. So we have our colleague from the Netherlands, Vice Minister Hedra, and sorry if I don't pronounce your name very well. And then we have His Excellency, the Deputy Minister from Ghana, His Excellency Gyan Mensah. And then we have His Excellency Kevin Hunter from Barbados, Mary Spray-Green of Oracle, and Christine Egan from CLASP. Now, we've put this panel together in a very conscious way to try and get a conversation going about what governments are doing, what technology can do, and also the role of a very experienced practitioner in the NGO sector who's been working for years helping consumers in various parts of the world in Christine Egan and CLASP. So, like I say, very, very deliberate choice of people here. And what we're going to do is ask a sort of leading question of each of our panellists and ask them to show what they've been doing in from their various lenses in this context of the short term. And then after that, we might have a chance. And if I could ask the panel, when you're listening to your fellow panellists speak, if anything occurs to you you'd like to ask each other, we'll try and make some time for that towards the end. So I'm going to start with the Netherlands, if I may, and just, from a government perspective, having, not long been through a similar crisis in 22, what sort of energy efficiency related actions have you been able to take to shelter people from the short term? And have you chosen those because of things you've learned in the recent past?
No. Indeed, a very good question. And the policies that you take are always additional policies because there's already a policy framework in place. We have long-term policies to move to more energy efficiency. So landlords are not allowed to rent out houses with bad energy labels, otherwise their rents go down. We forbid electric cars or the sale of non-electric cars beyond a certain date. So all these policies are already in place. But what do you do when an energy shock happens? And the most natural thing is to lower energy prices for consumers, lower VAT, lower excise taxes, lower the other types of electricity taxes. But that is what we did not do. We did not lower a single tax. And the reason is, if you lower taxes in a period when there's already an enormous energy shock, so there's less fuel available, you basically increase demand. So we didn't do that. What we did is we offered installation programs, quick installation programs to households. We did trade-in schemes where people could bring their old fossil cars and swap it for a second-hand, not a new, but a second-hand electric car. And for the most vulnerable households, we gave them a little bit of money when they showed us they were in the vulnerable group. So then the agency remained with them. They could use it to buy more energy, but they could also use it for different purposes. So the energy saving was still there. They could use their money in that way. And if they came forward to us, they immediately got other advice and they were referred to an insulation program. So this was kind of a mixture of measures that we tried to do to make it temporary, targeted, and ultimately transformative, the energy measures that we took.
That's a nice set of words, temporarily, transformative and targeted. We're seeing a lot of untargeted policy out there at the moment, and a lot of policy that's going to drive energy demand up. So kudos to you for spotting those opportunities. And so maybe I could go to Ghana now and ask what you think the role of energy efficiency is in your context of to help address supply shocks in a country where people just don't have enough energy already, and access has been a challenge over time. People struggle to pay bills, perhaps. What can you do with energy efficiency to help you in that situation?
Thank you very much. In our perspective, we see energy efficiency as helping consumers to be able to achieve the same or more output with less energy. And in this perspective, we believe that conservation is key, and you have to complement it with behavioral and then also technology tools like innovative tools. So in this case, once this is set, anytime there are shocks, consumers are able to quickly adapt within the short time. And I used this example recently with the happenings in the Strait of Hormuz. We realized that not on power, but on petroleum, for instance, government quickly has to intervene by reducing, taking some taxes or levies out. But when it came to the power generation itself, quickly, I think the adaptation of utilizing efficient gas usage, for instance, was able to hold us because we then didn't need the liquid fuels that would have depended on coming from maybe the Asians or something to power plants. But beyond this, we believe that as a government, energy efficiency is just beyond just protecting the consumers. We believe that it is about energy security, and we also believe that energy efficiency is also about fairness. So what steps government will put in place to ensure the households and businesses achieve that fairness is what we are putting in place. One of it is we are looking at what kind of fuel that we are using for our generation, which is more cost effective. And that is why we adapt the usage of gas to power. We have seen that gas to power is relatively cheaper as compared to using the liquid fuels. We also have seen something about transmission distribution losses, which also brings these losses and inefficiencies are put on the consumers. So mechanisms that we put in place to make sure that we reduce these losses, that the consumers do not bear this as a cost. So anytime that there are shocks, external shocks, the consumers are not able to take up additional costs to them. And we're also working on the demand side, that is the energy, the demand side. So making sure that there's much more education to prep consumers to make sure that they utilize what is needed so they don't also pay so much. So anytime that there are shocks, external shocks with outside, with this preparedness, consumers are able to hold themselves in. However, government also put in place some immediate steps, which I can see that is not sustainable, as we did. If government says it wants to subsidize for power, that is not sustainable. But when government looks at efficient or more cost-effective way of generating, like relying on the REs, renewable energy sources, like solar. Currently, we have done the solar ocean for the battery energy storage as well. And we are using a competitive procurement process so that we get the power at a relatively cheaper price so that the consumer can also bear it. So these are some of the measures government is putting in place to make sure that consumers do not overly take up additional costs when there are external shocks outside. So we are more dependent on local usage of our resources, like using our local production of oil and then also using our local production of gas to support our power generation. And this, I think, has been very efficient for our consumers.
Thank you. Very interesting points. Maybe I could go to Secretary Hunt, please. We've heard a lot about Barbados's demand-side measures and the success you've had. What lessons would you like to share with other countries on your recent experience?
Well, thank you very much, and good evening to the panel and everyone watching. Barbados has had and is still having a very unique experience from our perspective. 90% of our electricity is generated from imported fossil fuels. And so you can imagine the tremendous strain and drain on our resources that would have. In addition, we have the fuel adjustment clause, which would see the pass-through of any price variances immediately onto our customers and our consumers and their electricity bills. So the recent crisis has really provided for us not only a challenge, but I think an opportunity for us to really turn things around and add on the energy efficiency and energy conservation methods and policies that we've already implemented. So what do I mean? Well, unlike Netherlands, one of the things that we've done immediately, notwithstanding that it is not a viable long-term solution and it was never intended to be, government has sought to shelter the pass-through effect at the pump. And the transportation sector has been, or is, the second largest consumer of resources within Barbados. And so we've sought to put a hedge and cap both diesel and gasoline, the latter being capped at around $4.01 per liter, as opposed to the full pass-through of $4.70 and beyond. And while we know that that is not sustainable, that has been done to buy us some time to accomplish a couple of things. First, our approach has been our Prime Minister, the Honourable Mayor Moore Motley, and our Senior Minister, the Honourable Kerry Simmons, who's head of the energy sector. They have taken the perspective that this is now a matter of national security. And so because the government is seeing it as one of national security, against that framework, we've brought together every single possible player in the energy sector. The utility, we only have one utility on island, the regulator, the government, interveners, installers, attorneys, so as to fix all of the issues in our energy sector, whether it be regulatory, technical, legal, etc. And that is because we have a new target, and that target is to have 50% renewables onboarded onto a grid by the end of next year. So Barbados is in a massive push right now to be able to accomplish that. And to accomplish that, we need to have BESS onto our grid so as to stabilize the grid, also to unlock current projects that have been stalled, but then also to expand. So that's on one track. A parallel track to that is that we have already been working with institutions such as the IDB, etc., and we have rolled out several initiatives. For example, we've replaced approximately 88% of our street lights with LED bulbs. We are now embarking on a plan to replace those with smart LED bulbs so as to help reduce that demand and reduce that consumption. We have implemented policies that are aimed and targeted at not only small businesses and micro businesses in terms of incentives for them to pursue energy efficiency and energy conservation methods in their business practices, but we've also sought to cushion the impact upon the vulnerable among us, where we've seen a project where we've distributed well in excess of 11,000 LED bulbs to individual homeowners free of cost. We've also taken the step to completely electrify our public transportation bus fleet. And while we're not at 100%, we're well past 80%. And very shortly, we will be taking to Cabinet a cabinet paper that maps out a fuller, more extensive energy efficiency and energy conservation plan. And so we have those two things running in parallel so that the aim is by the end of next year to one, have 50% renewables onto our grid. Two, as we engage in a massive public awareness, public campaign and rollout of our plan, to be able to educate our populace, inclusive of individuals and businesses, as to the need for them to take advantage of the various incentives that we have, whether it ranges from refrigeration to reduction in taxes in the acquisition of EVs, and there are a number of different policies that we've put in place to all work together to help achieve this energy security that we so desperately need.
Thank you. So you've described something that those of us who work in energy efficiency often come up against, the fact that energy efficiency, unfortunately, is quite complicated. And you talked about all of the stakeholders you need to work with. And I think that's something that governments around the world have observed. You need to get those groups of people together to get them to act in concert, to understand what they each need to achieve in when you're setting up a policy to make it successful. So a great example of that. In terms of your short-term measures, where you've been trying to relieve the sort of increases in prices, have you been trying to target those measures at all, or are they broad-based across the community?
They're broad-based across the community.
Yeah. And for technical reasons, because it's hard to reach the more vulnerable households, or because you felt everybody feels the high prices, so everybody should be more or less compensated?
Correct, the latter. So we know that everyone feels the high prices, particularly at the pump. So that hedging is as it relates to gasoline and diesel only, whereas the other measures that I would have briefly referred to are across the board. As it relates to the more vulnerable, as I said, we've distributed free of cost LED bulbs to households. We are incentivizing persons in terms of refrigeration. We want to put standards in place and educate the public so that they know these are the types of appliances that you should be purchasing. So we have a cross-sectoral approach.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I think we'll come back to some of that in a minute.
That's
I'd like to go to Mary, if I may now. Now, Mary, we do a lot of training, capacity building for energy efficiency at the IEA, and one of the sort of segments we always do is on communications. Mm-hmm. And I use some old O-Power experience when doing that, because I find it tells a fantastic story about how you can influence consumers. And we see other things like, rooftop solar and things. It's much easier to persuade people to do those sorts of things. It's much easier to have this kind of peer pressure happening, yes. Whereas with energy efficiency that's much more difficult. But you've been experimenting with these opportunities through digital tools and techniques. So could you tell us a bit more about the evolution of that and what you think is coming next?
Yeah, it's a great question. And first of all, let me thank you for incorporating technology into this conversation, because I think what it really can achieve in this circumstance is scale. Digital channels are a way to reach people in a way that some of the traditional approaches, which we often see, community and in-person based or broad-based campaigns that we've heard about, and I know the IEA has done a tremendous amount of support and enablement around them. But digital personalized solutions, leveraging data, I think are really quite untapped. And we find that especially in the space of trying to engage and enroll vulnerable populations into energy efficiency and energy assistance programs. And that's not to say that they're not, digital solutions do not take the place of everything else that is happening today. Digital solutions are a way to amplify either broad-based campaigns or in-person and community-based engagement. And those community-based programs are incredibly important because of the trust that local organizations can bring to people. Trust is very important when an individual is considering assistance or entering any kind of program. And what we have found is energy suppliers or utilities are really best positioned to do this because they already have very rich customer data. And the first step is using that data to better understand and identify the households that are struggling the most, especially if you are in a situation where you need to target resources. And what we've done is we combine energy usage patterns, and that comes from the meter data from a household, with other available data sets like census data, if a nation uses that, housing characteristics. And these data sources combined create a much more complete picture of customer vulnerability. The next step then, of course, is you've identified the most vulnerable households, and then the next step is proactive, personalized engagement. So instead of sending the general communications, a utility is capable of notifying a customer when they're on track for a high bill, or ahead of a season of particularly high usage, or even moments where eligibility changes, program enrollment is opening. And I love that you mentioned O-Power and the behavioral science aspect, is we're applying that still today. And in this case, it's using social proof, helping an individual see that their neighbors are also struggling. Applying for assistance is not unusual. 400 of your closest neighbors have done the same. And then if ease of enrollment is the goal, technology has lots of venues depending on the population. I mean, there's text, you know, almost everyone has a mobile device. There's email, web, video. We even often will use phone call, automated phone call to households to direct customers to a digital one-stop shop that can determine eligibility, recommend the most relevant assistance and energy efficiency programs. And I'll just close with one example of this in practice, where we partnered with, in the United States, with National Grid to identify likely eligible and likely vulnerable energy customers. We engaged with them in this very personalized, proactive way. And the customers that engaged with the digital tools, they were twice as likely to enroll in the energy assistance programs than those who did not. And so these personalized digital solutions, they're not the answer to what we're talking about today, but I think they're a really underutilized tool that has a lot more that it can do.
Thank you. Yeah. And you've based this on decades now of experience and data and ways of synthesizing data and new data sets and things. What do you think's around the corner?
Can you say that again?
What's around the corner? What's next?
I am really interested in, so you mentioned using data, how we've leveraged it. It's machine learning on vast amounts of data and 175 utilities around the world ingesting trillions of data points. And machine learning is fantastic, and these insights that we can provide are wonderful. But I think what is exciting is the predictive components. How can we, ahead of someone reaching a moment of vulnerability, how can we catch them before they get there? How can we create an intervention? Some of you may have heard my joke about how if your HVAC system breaks if you're in a cold climate in the middle of winter or in a hot climate in the middle of summer, you are not thinking about what the most efficient, sustainable solution is for you. How can we use data and AI to get ahead of that, predict failure, and have interventions before you reach that moment of crisis? Because I'll tell you what I did, and we replaced our system because it was freezing. So that's what I'm excited for, and I really hope that data and data access can be a universal kind of tool that can be used really anywhere.
Very interesting. And of course, we've seen a lot more of that happening at an industrial level. So seeing how that can now be brought perhaps to a household level would be extremely interesting.
Exactly. Households at scale. It's impressive.
It's impressive. Christine, I'm sure a lot of this is music to your ears, clearly. And you also have decades of experience of trying to support governments with policy to improve the efficiency of appliances, which in turn always improve people's lives, but they can do that at a cost or less of a cost, depending on the choices that are made. So how would you like to kind of contribute to this debate?
Yeah, it certainly is music to my ears. I actually started my career working on the consumer side and helping people be informed, make decisions, and understand their use. And so, and then moved more to the supporting governments with policy and regulation side. But I think it's really important to bring, for those of us in rooms like this, to bring the two together. So for those of us who work on energy at the policy level, I think we sometimes can forget that consumers do not experience energy as kilowatt hours or gigawatts or barrels of oil, right? What they experience energy as is whether or not they can run the air conditioner affordably in a heat crisis. Many of us were probably in London Climate Week last week. It was hot, actually, right? And the buildings with cooling were the most packed sessions. So you can immediately make a connection, right, to the comfort of individuals and to the affordability. It's the decision of whether or not for a family event and a big cooking moment, we can afford to, do the extra running of the gas stove because natural gas prices are so high. And so I always like to place the work that we do to support governments in the context of those individual consumers, because as we work across there's about 50 countries where CLASP works, and the story is the same, which is that it's the households and also the small businesses, which is the economic mobility engine of all of our economies. It's those households, those that can least afford to pay relative to the income that they have, that are often using the least efficient equipment. And so in this context, we talk about energy efficiency as climate mitigation. Right now, it's a really key moment to talk about energy efficiency as energy security. I also want us all to remember that it's also consumer protection. It's an affordability policy. This is why in this moment, as we do our work with governments, we are encouraging direct subsidy and support to the most vulnerable, really targeting and identifying either through digital tools, but really thinking about the fact that the burden is falling inequitably, and adapting to and adjusting to and incorporating that. But we're also talking to governments about not missing the long-term view in this moment of crisis. This is the time to build for the next crisis. We, frankly, if you think about the last decade, between a warming planet and our geopolitical realities, it seems the next crisis is really always around the corner. And these, oh my goodness, events are happening with actually great frequency. And so you can almost guarantee, right, that there will be a next heat crisis, that there will be a next moment. And so we are really encouraging folks, even in countries, I thought Fatih was right on point earlier, noting the critical nature of air conditioning. Incredibly low penetration rates around the world of air conditioning in places like Brazil and India. You're talking single digits to low double digits in terms of the penetration rate. When it is 105 degrees Fahrenheit, you have to anticipate. It is a matter of human rights, actually, that people will want these purchases and will want air conditioners and cooling. And so if you start from the assumption that people actually require cooling, well, now we have a different problem to solve, and we absolutely have to build energy efficiency. And I would note that standards are a tool, minimum energy performance standards, that we promote broadly. It's very difficult, as Fatih said, to send the signal through prices to individual consumers, but also to put that decision on the backs of individuals who are making a lot of competing decisions in the moment, in their family and in their lives. It really needs to be built in on a regulatory basis. And even in some of the most efficient economies, those air conditioner standards can vary between 40 to 75% from the most efficient product to the least efficient product on the market. It's time to actually double down, to close those gaps, to go for ambition, to live up to our doubling energy efficiency commitments, if that's what we're talking about in the COP frame, and really essentially change the underlying vulnerabilities in the future, broadly, but also for the world's most vulnerable. And so that's how we like to think of the problem at CLASP and our partnership and our encouragement to government leaders.
Thank you, Christine.
You're welcome.
And you're covering there both the short-term need and what we can do for the long term, which is what we want to spend the whole of the next few days really talking about. So thanks for that emphasis. You talked about encouraging governments to go for the direct support because there is such a severe problem for certain members of society, I suppose, at the moment, some certain vulnerable households. What do you say to the people who say that just encourages them to use more energy?
I mean, I'm a bit of a skeptic of this argument. When you talk about many of the world's most vulnerable, the levels of energy consumption that we're talking about are incredibly small. You could double, triple, quadruple, and not get to what my household uses in a day, in a year, right? So I think we really, when we're really talking about the world's most vulnerable and targeting to those worlds, I think it's a bit of a misrepresentation, right? To say that as if everyone's consumption is equal, right? And that everyone's just going to skyrocket. We do a lot of work actually in the energy access sector of actually promoting the idea that folks are entitled to a minimum energy consumption level for a life. There is almost no country in the world, you just simply, if you see GDP per capita, it correlates to productivity, wealth, and quality of life. And so we often, again, promote that perspective. But I would say that there are important ways that you need to make those subsidy programs rational, appropriate, targeted, and ensure that they don't disrupt, and that they're actually tackling barriers for those low-income consumers. One of the programs that jumps to my mind is the UK Warm Homes program, which is targeting those who live in social housing and who actually do not have the ability to make purchase decisions because they are renters. They're tackling the renter divide, but they're who's paying the bills, right? They're paying the bills for that, for the equipment that gets installed. And so they're actually targeting the customers where they will get a direct economic benefit, and they're building a more sustainable electrified approach, tackling both heating and electric cooking. And so giving also, in this case, a cleaner home environment, less indoor air pollution, and again, improving health and quality of life for the most vulnerable population. So I guess my answer is, one, let's be realistic about the distribution of energy consumption and think about it in that way, but also target the programs and structure them in such a way that they're appropriate and not likely to disrupt markets, while recognizing that energy efficiency and the regulation of energy efficiency is necessary because it's invisible and it's a market failure. We won't, if we could get there, simply by those forces, it would be done by now, right? None of us would be on this stage, and we wouldn't be having the event. So let's be realistic about the problem we're tackling.
Thank you. Perhaps I could go back to Ghana, and what are your views on the debate between supporting the most vulnerable with immediate price relief and targeting to make sure that your public budget is being used most effectively? So how do you weigh up that balance?
Thank you very much. Before answering this, I must say that Ghana, in the last decade, we've experienced two global shocks. One is the Russia-Ukraine war with COVID, and then the most recent one, the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. And in these two instances, how governments have actually reacted to these two instances, the shocks that it brings into the sector, the energy sector. In the first instance, you could see that the government was a bit ill-prepared for it, so we actually caught off guard. All of a sudden, prices of petroleum products actually skyrocketed. We went as much as almost about $2.3 per liter. In the same vein, what we experienced recently, we realized that even though the prices was going up, it was not actually going, the price at the pump was not going up astronomically as compared to the previous year. This because of the policies the government put in place. One of which was having a very resilient local currency to hold the gap, and then also the quick utilization of local production of oil within Ghana also helped us to be able to cushion the additional costs that ordinarily the government would have incurred. But back to the question, in Ghana we have a system we call it the Energy Sector Recovery Program, where in the past we have accumulated a lot of costs on energy distribution and energy consumption, because in the past some government institutions which are on postpaid meters were not paying us within time. Also, we have some individuals using power without paying. Then also within the COVID period, government actually subsidized the electricity cost for every household. So not only the vulnerable, but so all this costs was there. And this is what currently government has done, is that quickly they have introduced some kind of a tax, because one, already petroleum prices are low, so just to cushion and to be able to pay the outstanding debt. We've also had discussions with IPPs where they have agreed and also given some kind of haircut on how much accumulated debt that government owes them. But that is because the government also made proactive steps to be able to clear all outstanding and giving some timelines to make sure that all debts are cleared. With this taken out, government is now putting in place measures that we pay cost-reflective tariffs. And for us to be able to pay cost-reflective tariff and also make sure that the consumer is not overburdened, whether a vulnerable class or a higher class, is just to make sure that the cost of the electricity generation or the energy generation itself should be reasonable, that everybody will be able to take it up. Beyond that, we have very extreme cases where we've had some support from donor countries where we have the mini grids for rural areas, and then we have also the solar rooftop project the government is undertaking also to help sustain some rural areas who cannot pay much more cost reflective. By adding to that, our tariff system is also progressive. So the progressive tariff helps us to also manage efficiency. So if you know you are within the vulnerable stage, you cannot consume power to some extent where you cannot afford it. So we have the band for the vulnerable stage. Beyond that, the tariff keeps increasing. So that in itself is more or less a way to check overconsumption. But however, government also quickly have to look at industries so that those cost-effective tariff does not also adversely affect industries. So there are some discussions in some industries, like those in the steel industry, have some tax incentives that is given in terms of the power generation side. So generally, I must say that we are looking at the costs, how well we'll be able to minimize the cost of generation so that it will translate into a more cost-effective tariff. And that is why we are looking at all sorts of relatively cheaper sources. One is currently we are doing more of the renewables. Our target is that by 2030 we should be able to achieve no less than 10% of our generation mix from renewables. However, in Ghana we do almost about 20% of our power generation from the hydro. But when we are talking about renewables, we don't add it because once we add the hydro to it, we feel we've achieved quite significant steps in the renewables. So we always discount it so that we can focus on other conventional renewable sources like solar, wind, and then also even with nuclear, which currently the government is aggressively pursuing the nuclear processes. And this are all just to make sure that we get the energy needed at a relatively cheaper price. And then also to add, Ghana currently, I can say, is amongst one of the countries within the sub-region with a higher electricity access. Currently, we are doing almost about 90% of electricity access. And beyond that too, when it comes to even EVs, Ghana is also one of the leading countries with the higher number of EVs. So we see that demand from the EV, demand from data centers coming up is obviously going to shoot up our demand. So quickly we have to put in more effective generation mix to be able to meet the rising demands, or supplies to meet the rising demands. And that is why we are considering aggressively other renewable sources like the solar is what currently we are pushing, solar backed with a battery energy storage system. And then we have also had some investors coming in with wind. We are currently having mounted any of them, but we've made some progress. And finally is the pursuit for nuclear energy to support our generation mix. So by and large, I must say that our focus more is to deliver the energy, but at a relatively cost-effective rate. And that is what the government is pursuing.
Thank you. Maybe I could go back to the Netherlands. And if you reflect on what Mary's points about digital tools and how you've seen them evolve in the Netherlands over the years, what do they enable you to do now that you couldn't do 5 years ago?
Yep. Indeed, I really like Mary's comments. A lot of different aspects are worth consideration. I mean, having the data is extremely important to know who are the vulnerable households. So what we do is we combine the data of the energy corporations together with the other statistical data on income levels, on educational levels, on health data, with the microdata. And that's available for researchers. Of course, you cannot tap into that as a government official and say, hey, because for privacy concerns, but at least you get an idea. What are the neighborhoods where there are vulnerable households? And well, Christine was already also saying that the additional benefits that you have from energy policies like cleaner air, but also children that are less often sick when they're in a better insulated home, better educational performance, and you can actually get that when you exchange the data and really target government policies where they're needed most and work together with local policies. Because there was also what Mary was saying. I mean, you can get that far with digital solutions, with data, but ultimately you need somebody on the ground to reach the vulnerable households. You need to know where to target and who to target. And when you do that, it's often very difficult to get behind the front door. Especially the most vulnerable households are very difficult. And well, our approach has always been try to get into a conversation, help people immediately, for instance, with reflective foils, with restoring the cracks in the windows. And when with local communities you work together, you've restored trust. Usually it's not government officials that do the best, but more sort of public-private kind of cooperation structures. Then you can also help them and get them to the more advanced solutions and tell them, hey, here's this solution. You have a smart meter. This is how you can control your energy. Let me help you set it up in a manner that you lower your electricity bill. So it's really this kind of combination of digital insights from the data, digital solutions also for households, and personal contact with people that help to use the digital tools. That's like what works best in our case.
Yeah, interesting. So Mary, we're generally speaking a policy community that we're trying to find out what governments can do in particular. Of course, with the support of the rest of the kind of stakeholder group that we need to engage with. But if you had one thing that you could ask governments to do to make sure that the tools and techniques that you're starting to use at scale are available to all, what would you ask of government?
I have a few answers to that, but I think
a polite one, please.
I'll pick one. I think the biggest one, and you just touched on this, is there are challenges with access to data and privacy and outbound communication in many nations. And so one of the things that we've been able to do for our programs in the United States is a utility has an authority that's oversimplified to say a primary purpose use of data and communication to their customers. And so one of the things that OPower pioneered is these programs are not opt-in. They're not looking for consumers to raise their hand and say, I need help, what can you do for me? The approach is an opt-out one. And there are barriers to having opt-out, personalized communication. You can tell, the utility can tell with data and technology, household A is very likely highly vulnerable, very likely eligible for a program. And there are barriers to the utility or the ministry, whichever one, to proactively text, call, email that household and say, this is what we think is happening and here are some things you can do about it. I think that's a pretty significant barrier in a number of countries. I think the EU has done such an incredible job protecting PII and how people are communicated with, but it does create a barrier in this kind of circumstance to actually reach people where they are.
So
I have no. I don't know who's going to solve that.
Yeah,
but,
I was going to ask you for the solution actually. So, do you have an idea of what best practice looks like in terms of protecting personal data and information, and yet making it available to those who can do good with it?
Yeah, and I actually think the example in the Netherlands is probably a very strong one of how you protect data. But in the United States, utility, the energy supplier relationship is regulated on the subnational U.S. state level. And there are very strong regulations around how that data can be used and what the utility uses it for. And it's not to sell something, it's not to convince somebody to purchase solar rooftop. It is a very specific purpose, and I think, you can see from my title, I come from the regulatory background. And so my tendency is to say, you regulate it. And you find a way to ensure that the entity that has the data, access to the data, and the entity that has the customer relationship. So that's why I keep going back to the utility, that they have the regulatory framework that protects the customer data and ensures you're only using it to the benefit of the customer and not the supplier or a third party. So whenever we do these programs, it's not Oracle or O-Power. It is on behalf of the utility energy supplier and through all of the regulatory frameworks and structures that protect the data and the customer. So I'd be happy if you want to follow up after to see how that looks in practice, where we have been able to do that. I'm happy to do that.
That would be really interesting.
Yeah.
And I'd like to go back to Christine, if I may, because my observation in this part of the world is that some of the emerging and developing economies that we work with are more prepared to take a risk when it comes to trying new things.
Absolutely.
They don't have procedures that are cast in stone and inflexible. And we're seeing huge leaps and bounds happening in terms of use of digital techniques and technologies in some of the big emerging economies. What do you think they have to teach the rest of us?
Yeah, I mean, as I was listening to the discussion, I was actually thinking about just sort of the variability of global context, right? In the sense that there really is quite a wide variety of ways governments relate to these issues of data privacy, and even who has the sort of regulatory authority and the role of utilities and all of this for energy efficiency. It's handled quite differently in different parts of the world. And I'm actually struck. I noted that I came into this space actually working on helping consumers to make good choices, energy efficient choices. I ended up on the regulatory side because it felt too slow. And so going one customer at a time and, attaching information to behavior change, which the research shows is not so straightforward. I'm a very restless person, so, the idea that you could actually just set a threshold, right? And say, actually, we're going to take that choice. We're going to, as a government, say everyone deserves the protection of an air conditioner consuming only X, right? But what I find really interesting about these digital technologies and where we are in time and space is that actually you can find the need for speed, right? because you can actually target who actually needs it and identify subgroups and populations where there is vulnerability and there is exposure. That, to me, government has its job to support, protect, empower its most vulnerable citizens and its citizens at large. And so I think in a lot of places you would find appetite for government to take on. I'm thinking of, again, I've been in Barbados recently for an event there and thinking about what I observed from just the connection of community there and the nature of how everything is coming from imported fossil fuels, and you really feel that when you're on the island, just to be clear. I bet your government would have a little bit more appetite for risk, and frankly, the relationships and the trust, actually, with its citizenry about that. And so I think the digital tools offer a moment, and in other parts of the world, in emerging and developing economies, I think there is an appetite for risk, and I would encourage exploration and partnerships. I hadn't really thought of it, to be honest, before I was sitting, and it's a little bit, back to the beginning for me. But I wonder in the conversations that we had with our government partners if there wouldn't be appetite. Consumer information campaigns can be so costly, right?
Yes.
And it's so hard to get metrics of impact.
Yes.
Right. It's very hard to get attribution of what did we achieve. To me, this is a way to actually get very concrete, right? In the same way that you would for a replacement program or a switch out program, that we achieved X, Y, or Z for these communities in these ways. And so it seems like an area of fertile experimentation. And I definitely think there are governments out there with appetite for that risk.
I think that's actually a great place to stop, because I think we've just started to design a project.
We did.
We did, in fact.
And I'd like to see us, put this on paper and come up with a concept and see what we can do with it, because there's got to be something in this that we can use to scale the opportunity we all know is there, to make sure that it's equitable, to make sure we have the metrics so that we can prove that we've been effective, or where we have and where we can make changes. So it looks like there's a half-baked cake there. We just need to refine the recipe a bit, and I'd be very keen to talk to the panel about how we can do that. In the interest of time, because we started late, I will stop there, and I would like to thank you all for your contributions. I've really enjoyed this, and I think we can take this somewhere.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I think they'd like a picture of the panel, if you wouldn't mind.
I wonder if I'm allowed to put